Suppose instead of in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, God said, in the beginning, God created the four fundamental forces that formed all scientifically observable effects in the universe. Although there was a fifth force, which 70% of the universe is made of, that's inexplicable, but it allows it to exist. So here we have a picture potentially, this idea of the Big Bang, and here's the four forces being emitted out. And the weak nuclear force, that is what, along with strong nuclear force, holds matter together and it gives it mass. And then you have electromagnetic, that allows us to see the matter and then also interact with it. And then there's gravity, and gravity allows the planets and the stars to form, but it doesn't really allow us to understand how the whole universe is held together, in particular, like galaxies. And it doesn't describe that. So that's where that fifth force that's unexplainable, dark matter and dark energy, comes in, because it allows for understanding, even though it can't be measured, but how the universe is held together, and galaxies don't just split apart. So if we're thinking about this, you know, most people might think this was more information than they wanted when they read the Bible and saw in the beginning. But like if you're a scientist, this still wouldn't be enough. They would want to know exactly how it started to unfold, how these forces came about. And so there's this idea of the Big Bang, and they postulate time wise, energy wise, and temperature wise, how these forces were at one time all unified together. They called it the grand unification epoch. And then at the Big Bang, they started to expand outwards and started to separate. And it was basically based off of temperature. As the temperature started to decrease, then they started to split apart. And this is lots and lots of energy here. It's these are what they call giga electron volts. And if you equate them back to joules, that's normally how they measure energy. It's like 10 to the 44th joules, they say, is what was blasted initially. And so as these started to separate out into the four different forces, then at different points, matter started to form. And there was something called the nuclear synthesis stage in nuclei, and then eventually atoms. But that would probably want to be investigated in detail, and the design of that included in the beginning. So scientists wouldn't be happy with even this amount of information. So they'd probably want to see something like this. This is a they call the standard model that shows all the different particles, where you have on the left side what's called fermions, and those are basically particles that give structure and mass, and they really don't move. Whereas you have these bosons, they give energy, the ability to move across free space, in particular, like photons. And so it's broken down such that, like quarks, that those relate to the strong forces, leptons relate to the weak forces, and then these what they call gauge bosons are particles that allow the force again to move through free space. If like if you have what's called gluons, those work inside of the nucleus to hold the nucleus. together. And then there's something that's throughout the entire universe that helps give mass to the universe. It's called scalar bosons, and they work in something called the Higgs field, which is all throughout the universe. And so we have that amount of detail, and then of course they've gone even more in this because this idea of quarks, those are made up of several different kinds. They call them flavors. And if you're a physicist, you would probably think of these as exciting flavors: up, down, charm, strange, top, bottom. And not only do they have what they would call uh, up and down, they have anti-up and anti-down, anti-charm, and those, so that there's like matter and antimatter that goes along with this. And then there's 6 flavors of these things called leptons, and they're shown here. And they both have a matter and antimatter half, as it's shown. And so there's like quarks and anti-quarks, as they're saying, and leptons and anti-leptons. And those are very important ideas because when those came together, they should have all canceled out, but there was like some leftovers, and that was what was matter for the universe to form, and all matter inside. And so there's another video called The Dance of the Quarks that goes through this actually a little bit more in detail. But this right here is, even as detailed as it is, would still probably not make scientists all that happy. They'd want to know even more and more and more as they do more research. But again, if we put this inside of the Bible in the beginning, most people would think this would be like totally overwhelming. And then if God really described this in the actual way it was created, it probably would be beyond anybody's ability to understand. And so it says in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and then let there be light. But also in the book of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, and all things were made through him. So this idea of the Word, this is how God chose to keep things simple, is just by saying he created by his Word. And so essentially God spoke and things were created. Well, of course, that takes faith to believe that. And so God spoke this, and it was given to us. But it says in Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen is not made out of what was visible. And that is really key, that last part there, not made out of what is visible. So if we kind of take that idea a little bit farther, what we know about this idea of the Big Bang is it started out with what they called a singularity, and it had a bunch of particles in it. And of course, nobody knows where those particles came from, but that's kind of what this is alluding to. They were not made out of what was visible. So they come out of this idea of something that sort of like out of nothing. And so we have this idea of the Big Bang again, and everything's exploding outwards. And in this idea of everything exploding outwards, there's the idea that space is being created. So it's like a 3-dimensional space, and then along with it, time is being created with it as it's expanding outwards. And so as it's expanding outwards, we can think of this as sort of like information over time. And if we put a circle around this, what we have is we have inside, we have time and space. And then outside, there's no time and no space. So we can only imagine what's inside time and space, and we only can measure what's in time, inside time and space. What's outside time and space, it's literally impossible for men to get to, or for men to understand. So, when we think of science, we're limited to time and space and within this little ball here. But outside time and space, we could think of God as being out there, and by spirit, that is how God interacts with what he's created here. But it also says that Christ, or Jesus, was the creator, and it says that all things were created by him and for him. And so that would be a way for God to interact with this little ball here, is Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, allows interaction with this ball. If we want to think about this ball, though, and the idea of these particles and blasting out, there's what I'll call initial conditions. And this is an engineering term, initial conditions. And initial conditions are what are set to allow various processes to be analyzed and to be able to figure out what's going to happen after certain amounts of time. Well, I like to think of this as part of God's design process. First of all, by spirit, that's how these particles get here. And if we want to think of this idea of the Trinity, I think of the Father as the scientist. So he's the scientist. And then the Son is like the engineer, because it says all things were created by him and for him. So he's the engineer. And then the Holy Spirit is what I'll call the builder. So he builds it out. And if we take this idea that God is outside of time and space, what this allows God to do is at any point, because there's really this no idea of time and space, he could look back in, or he can look out. So he has full view of this, and really he's at both ends and all around, and he can look at it from any angle within this reference frame that we're in. So that is going to be a crucial idea here in just a second. But this idea that God is outside of time and space, it actually lends a little bit of understanding to this idea of let there be light, that when God spoke these words, he didn't speak, he would have to speak them inside of this ball, because outside of it, there is no time or no space, and it's really an instant. And one great theologian, probably the greatest of all time, Augustine, St. Augustine, he put it this way. He said, all things spoken eternally, for what was spoken was not spoken successively. One thing concluded, that the next thing might be spoken, but all things together and eternally. And so this idea of let there be light to God is just for our reference frame, within our reference frame, but him outside of it, seeing all time, all space, since he is not constrained by those, he has full view of them at any instant in our time frame. And then one day he's going to review that. So we can kind of think of this as a recording. And this is a recording that's going on. It's recording our actions, recording everything. And he has full view in both directions. So the other thing about this idea of the initial conditions in the Big Bang and the big blast of it is I believe this allows us to have a wonderful way of viewing something that's been a big problem with theological ideas for a long time, is that how could God be sovereign, but at the same time, we have free will? So this idea of the blast itself allows us to think of randomness. And the randomness of the blast gives us a perspective to allow that things will unfold in a way from our perspective is free will. And so I call this our free will zone. And I ran this idea past Chat GPT, and I laid it out in another video, in a couple of them. One of them is the dance of the quirks, and also if you look at another one called Infinity over one, I believe, and a couple of the other videos go to this idea in a lot more detail. And one of them is, oh yeah, the other video is called Sovereignty, Free Will, and Quantums. And so if you want to have a better idea how this idea of the Big Bang could give free will, and I used again a lot of different ways to try to test this idea using artificial intelligence just to run it through the algorithm to make sure the idea was consistent with with how probability could allow that. And so if you're interested in that, I'd watch that. But this idea of the free will zone, there's two things that are important here. One is the sovereignty of this, and the initial conditions means that there was a plan. And if there was a plan, then there's also meaning and purpose. And if there's meaning and purpose, then that means that we have to, and we have free will, then that means that we're become responsible to the plan. So God didn't want to leave us without any way to have any direction in life. And that is why he interacted with us through Jesus. And as the visible image of the invisible God, he was our interaction. He was the one that allows us to know what God's plan really was as the fulfillment of all the prophecy, and as the one that was able to transcend really both this world and the next, as claimed by the apostles and the many that saw him after the resurrection. And so what was really interesting about this is how could Jesus be the visible image of the visible God as human, but at the same time be outside of it, holding all things together, because it says all things were held together by him. So he's both inside interacting when he came, and then at the same time he was outside holding it together, literally holding his own body together from the aspect of his deity. So how do those two meet? Well, I did propose through another couple of videos on how this happens. One of them's called One Over Infinity, and I hope you'll take a look at that. And then there's another one um, called Domains that will also describe that in terms of mathematical concept of what's called a transform. So anyways, I'm hoping that this was enlightening, that you'll consider watching some more of these videos to see what mathematical concepts such as infinity and the idea of quantum mechanics and those kind of things, how can they give us better understanding through science of really how God potentially created, but they also give us a way to think about God and have analogies to better understand what God as the creator, because God, through his creation, reveals himself. And it tells us that in various parts of the Bible. And so, really, this is all about understanding God's glory and then using science to help us to better understand our own world